where Barbados, Jamaica, Grenada, and Dominica took action to ban South African goods in solidarity with the people of South Africa. Recognizing that though they were thousands of miles away, there was an injustice being perpetrated, man's inhumanity to man, that required people who had little power to take a stand and to say, wrong is wrong.
In this video, the Prime Minister of Barbados gave this speech in Africa, and it is very in-depth, and there are a lot of things that we need to learn from this speech. I personally enjoy listening to Mia Mondli, her speeches that she gives around the world. I think she's one of the best speakers the world has ever known. She calls for countries in the Caribbean, Trinidad and Tobago, all other countries in the Caribbean, Jamaica, and all other countries to come together, work together for the common good of the people. This is the kind of leadership that we need in our countries. So she calls them to come together and also partner with their friends in Africa in order to foster development among all these nations. This lecture was given at the 20th annual lecture of Nelson Mandela in South Africa. So let's watch the video together and we'll come back and talk about it. But before we watch the video, if you haven't yet liked the video, kindly like the video and also subscribe to the channel. Let's watch the video together.
And their efforts were soon followed months later in April of 1960 in our sister island in Trinidad and Tobago, where the dock workers of Trinidad refused to take the cargo from South Africa off the ships in April of 1960 and refused to refuel the ship that had brought the cargo, recognizing that even though they were dock workers and not capable of great and grave decisions, they could do what they could within the space that they could. And their work was to be followed then, of course, by that titan of Caribbean revolution and social reform, Fidel Castro, El Comandante, who worked then with that other great Caribbean titan, Michael Manley of Jamaica, well known perhaps to many of you. And of course, our own father of independence, Errol Walton Barrow, who worked with Fidel Castro in the struggle for the liberation of the peoples of Southern Africa by allowing the planes that left Havana, Cuba, to refuel in Bridgetown, Barbados, in order to bring the troops into Southern Africa, and in particular, Southwestern Africa. And then, of course, there was the decision of the Commonwealth heads of government. And I remember as a young law student in London, caught up in the fervor of the anti-apartheid movement and caught up in the passion of wanting to see your own imagery on television, because in those days you just didn't. And when we saw the students of South Africa week after week rise up to take their future into their own hands, it placed the pressure on leaders like Margaret Thatcher and others, such that by the time the Commonwealth heads of government meeting went to Nassau, Bahamas, a determination was made to establish the Eminent Persons Group. And in that Eminent Persons Group, co-chaired by Malcolm Fraser of Australia and Chief Obasanjo of Nigeria, it also included a woman who was to become the first Governor General of Barbados, Dame Nita Barrow, who came here as one of the 7 persons to determine whether there could be a platform for talks and for release in order to ensure that the ungodly and unconscionable actions of apartheid could be brought to an end. Regrettably, their work was to be stymied by the then government, but they were capable and able at the time to meet Madiba. And it is instructive what they wrote in their unanimous report about Madiba in 1986, and I quote, "Having visited him on 3 occasions, what was their assessment? That he impressed us as an outstandingly able and sincere person whose quality of leadership were self-evident. We found him unmarked by any trace of bitterness, despite his long imprisonment. His overriding concern was for the welfare of all races in South Africa in a just society. He longed to be allowed to contribute to the process of reconciliation." This was not post-release. This was not on the eve of release. This was still deep in the bowels of his imprisonment. And you know, I've deliberately decided to take a segue this afternoon before addressing the fundamental issues, because it is important that we contextualize the struggle and the values for those who refuse to be reminded, or who fail to be reminded, or who are not reminded, may well believe that this was as easy as dealing with the twinkle of an eye with the remediation and reparation of an awful thing. It hurt me to hear that there are some who believe that Madiba did not do enough, and perhaps worse for a few, that he might have been a sellout. All because what they believe, justifiably so, should be theirs today is not yet theirs. I've deliberately started this conversation this evening by carrying you back to the 1950s and stopping in the 1980s and stopping again in the 1990s. Because if there is any one single truth, it is that each of us runs our leg of the relay. And the baton is all that can be required of us to carry. And yesterday I had the distinct honor of going to the Foundation's headquarters in the Center of Memory, and of reading, and I feel so privileged to be given copies of the transcript in Madiba's own handwriting, and I shall treasure them as long as I have breath. But in reading his own assessment of where he was and what he believed had happened, in what was to become the beginning of chapter 1 of the presidential years, it was ironic that he started with the words, "Men and women all over the world, right down the centuries, come and go." Men and women all over the world, right down the centuries, come and go. What is more significant for me is that as he ended that first chapter, he also reflected on the fact that he sought at no stage for the fame that was to follow him, and that the notion that he could be regarded as a saint was one that he thoroughly rejected. And the last words, I never was one even on the basis of an earthly definition of a saint as a sinner who keeps trying. My friends, we need to pause sometimes and to remember context always. And I do so because in a very real sense, that which I've come to address you today on too is the subject of a great struggle, and will be the subject of a struggle that will require many different people to run their different legs of the baton, of the race, to hand over the baton. And the example of Madiba is the example more than any other that I would want us to hold on to, because in so doing, it is the values that he exhibited, the moral example, the moral compass that he provides, that gives us both the strength and the capacity to run this race, which will be the greatest race that humanity will require of any generation. It stands out for me that at the very outset, courage was never lacking. It is a cause for which I am prepared to fight, but a cause for which I am prepared to die. How many of us can say that today? It was the moral fortitude of a man that determined that no type of offer with special conditionalities for early freedom would be acceptable, because what was required was justice. It is amazing that in the face of the gravest and greatest inhumanity, not just to himself, to his family, to his people, that the vengeance that would otherwise eat and force others into action was absent from his mind, body, and spirit. And as I just read to you from the evidence of the Eminent Persons Group, not conveniently so as an act of politics, but as an act of character, deep in the bosom of his imprisonment. And then there's the story that was told to me yesterday by Cello, as we looked at the photographs of what his cell contained. And I well recall my own visit to Robben Island 20 years ago. And all who, like me, have practiced a little criminal law in my career know that that is a common sight in colonial constructed prisons that had no sanitary facilities. And the humility of the man captured best in being able to ensure that when one of his own brothers was unable to take care of themselves in the most basic and human of ways, that Madiba performed the duties of cleaning for him. An example of servant leadership, if ever there is one. So forgive me if I have strayed a bit, because I believe that in this world where everything is instantaneous and quick, and where people expect results like that, We sometimes need to remind ourselves of the context of the struggles that we fight, and to remind ourselves of what truly was at stake. There are some young people who would simply now, 3 decades after his release, will only know of Nelson Mandela in the context of a history book or in the stories told by others, but would not appreciate what it is to be prevented from being able to love who you want, to work where you want, to live where you want, to do what you want, in ways that are simply not capable of contemplation today. But we can't talk about economic justice and economic opportunity if the basic aspects of freedom have not been guaranteed. No one expects us to be stuck in a moment of time, but it is the understanding that he did what was his to do. It is now up to us to do what is ours to do. And it is for that reason I've come to KwaZulu-Natal. You know, we live in a world that is at a very strange moment in time. It has been described recently as a polycrisis. And it has been so described because as soon as you get accustomed to managing one crisis, you've been hit with another one and another one and another one. And that is what it has felt like in the last few years. This country already knows what it is to lose people to the ravages of a public health crisis as you did with HIV and AIDS for so long. Then to have to face, like the rest of us, the awful pandemic of COVID-19, taking away so many. All of us know people who have died in the last few years. None of us dreamt of a moment when our movement would be restricted such that we couldn't do the things that we wanted to do. And this was not being imposed on us by authoritarian governments. This was being imposed by public health specialists for the safety and survival of all of us. And as if that were not enough, because we were already fighting the climate crisis, we were still recovering from the financial crisis of 2008-9. As if all of that was not enough, then comes the awful scourge of the cancer of inflation, the cancer of the cost of living. And believe you me, it is a cancer, because you keep trying to run after it and run after it, but you can't catch up with it in that way. And we have now to come to understand that as much as we needed to mobilize to fight against vaccine inequity, that we were not a one-issue country or a one-issue people, that we literally had to fight these multiple crises, because as all of this is happening, people were still dying from the climate crisis. I don't talk about the climate change. Change happened a long time ago. Crisis is where we are, and crisis is what we have to fight. And today, I want us to recognize that what is required of us is going to have to allow us to, one, develop partnerships in places where we may never have dreamt of so doing before, and to be able to do things in new ways that we had never thought of doing, and that the actions required are not simply those of others, but of us, because it is the collective action that has led the world to be where it is today. There is no doubt that those primarily responsible for the increase in greenhouse gas emissions are the G20 countries, for whom 80% of the responsibility is there. Within that context, The traditional colonial powers who benefited from the Industrial Revolution through our blood, our sweat, and our tears have been the ones who have effectively put the world in this position of warming. Theirs is the stock of gases. But then there are those who continue today, for which there are many of us. No name, no blame, because it's all of us. And it is the combined effect of the stock primarily, but yes, the flow today that continues to cause the problems. I want us to reflect on the principles of justice and solidarity and on the moral compass that Madiba provided for us. To understand that what is required of us is to be able to deconstruct and to reconstruct much of what we do. We have come to a stage where the evidence of the science is palpable. I didn't know when I accepted to do this speech that you, the people of KwaZulu-Natal, would have, in this week of our Lord, this year, suffered additional damage. The second river breaking its banks in less than 6 months. The first one causing loss of life and damage, this one continuing the loss of damage.
Welcome back. So in this video, there are lots of lessons that is meant to be learned in this video. So Mia Montley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, was invited to the 20th annual Nelson Mandela Lecture in South Africa, and this are excerpts of some of the speech that she gave at the occasion. And I think there are a lot of things that needs to be learned in this particular speech, because there are a lot of things that she talked about. She mentioned of exemplary leadership of the leader Nelson Mandela, which she says that all other leaders should learn to emulate. He was a very humble person. He worked so hard in order to stand for whatever that he believes in. So as leaders, it is incumbent on us to also work very hard and stand for whatever that we believe in. We should not just fall for anything, but we should stand by things that are right, things that are true, and things that are just. She also mentions on responsible leadership. Okay, now leaders around the world nowadays show some level of, I would say, they don't concern themselves about things that worry their citizenship. Someone may call it an irresponsibility, but she calls that leaders should be very responsible for their people, work for their people so that their people could live lives that is worth emulating. The basic necessities of life will not be difficult for citizenry in all countries of the world to have, but it will be at their disposal easily. When leaders are responsible, all other things work together for the citizenry in the country, because if leaders are very responsible and they work together to help their citizenry, it is going to help the countries in terms of health, economy, education, agricultural infrastructure, and every other single thing. She also mentions one crucial thing about Nelson Mandela that I think we need to talk about. You see, Nelson Mandela was in prison for a whole number of years. But while he was in prison, he did not hold any grudge or any kind of negative energy against anyone. But he had a very forgiving spirit. This is something that I think that we need to also imbibe in ourselves as citizens and even as leaders. Thank you very much for watching this video. I want to know what you also learned from the video. So comment down below whatever you learned from this video. Let me know what your thoughts are on this video. Thank you very much for watching this video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Just click the subscribe button down there. Click on the subscribe button. Click as well on the notification bell. And I'd like to see you again in my next video.